Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Firstly, Shaykh Omar Qureshi, for me, is a dear friend above all, and someone's always an inspiration, because he's one of those kinds of friends who's so, connected with knowledge that sometimes you have to force yourself to remember the social niceties. There's always be, Assalamu alaikum Sidi, have you read this book? Have you found this book? And someone whose passion and dedication for knowledge is impressive in person, and it manifests in anything that he teaches or talks about. MashaAllah, Shaykh Omar studied overseas with distinguished scholars. You can see his biography in the event description, so I won't go into that. He is principal of an Islamic school in Chicago, and he's doing his PhD in the philosophy of education. But above all, he is a person of knowledge and a person of depth in his knowledge, and someone who is very fitting to tackle a subject like the one that we have at hand, on the problem of understanding evil, that why does Allah allow suffering in the world. And this is an issue that, if you look at it as from Islamic theology, it's not really a central issue in Islamic theology per se. It's not a complication when it comes to Islamic beliefs. There's issues in Islamic theology that are direct problems. The question of how do we understand the speech of Allah? There's questions related to transcendence, because there's verses in the Quran that appear to affirm the contrary. So those are direct issues. But this is an issue that arose within the Islamic tradition, and also is a very critical issue for us living in a context of societies and civilization shaped by its Christian heritage, where the problem of evil is a very central problem. Because if you, for reasons that Shaykh Omar will get into inshallah, so much so that they are leading Christian intellectuals and theologians, the thing that made them leave belief in God was not the realization that the Bible has changed. It was not the problem of Trinity and how could that make sense, etc. It was a problem of evil. Bart Ehrman, for example, refers to it as God's problem, quote unquote. Okay? Because if you define God as being good, then how could there be that which is not good, that which is blatantly evil in the world? Though one of my kids requested not to attend this class because he thought evil was talking about like gruesome things or something. But I said, but it's an important topic. He said, but it is simple. I said, why is it simple? He says, because evil happens because there's people who choose to do evil. Right? So he excused himself. And I let him go. But it's a very important question, even if one doesn't think about it directly, but being in the environment that we're in, very often questions arise. That unconsciously, as to why the question is arising, we wonder, how come there's suffering? How come there's pain around us, but even in our own lives? That why is Allah sending me these difficulties, these trials, these hardships? So these are very important questions, and the way Shaykh Omar teaches, he likes questions. Right? So do raise your hands, and when he asks you to engage, please do so. And that'll make it much more beneficial for all of us, inshaAllah ta'ala. Don't feel that, well, he's giving a lecture, at the end of the lecture you can take some questions, although we will have time dedicated to that at the end. But correct me if I'm wrong, but class, if he asks you to engage, please do so, but also do ask your questions as he goes around. Just raise your hands, and inshallah that will magnify the benefit bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So with that rambling introduction, here's Shaykh Omar Qureshi. Can I have that tea? Okay.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على مولانا محمد في كل لمحة ونفس عدد ما وسع علم الله يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي وصلى الله على سيدنا Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, it's an extreme honor to be here. I know Shaykh invited me in the first hub that I didn't get a chance to visit, so alhamdulillah, it's nice to finally visit the hub, and may Allah bless all of you and bless this work. To have a place like, to be sitting down in a manner like we're doing right now, I think it's a dream for all of us. For Allah has facilitated the realization of this dream through the hands of Shaykh Faraz, so Allah yahfazhu. So alhamdulillah, it's an extreme blessing, and we want to, inshallah, this is one of the many reasons why, tonight, and is one of the reasons why such a place is needed, and that's what's missing, in the community in the United States and in Canada. Okay, I'm in Canada. In Canada is these type of spaces where we can come and discuss and converse, and conversation is important. Ideas are important, I think, and if anybody is not convinced of the importance of ideas, then we should have a conversation too about that, because ideas, that is what motivates us, or that's what leads to actions, and it's what guides each and every one of our actions, and that's what's in the world today. It is a battle of ideas, and it's the ideas that are taking place, and we're seeing the fruition of various ideas, and not all ideas are good. Some are evil. Right, and so we have to make sure that conversations are important, and ideas and getting things clear in our minds is the first step. And once we have a clear conception of things, and then clear and sound action will follow. So thought and action in that sense. So that's why Imam Bukhari, one of his, he has a chapter titled باب العلم قبل العمل, right? قبل القول والعمل. That this is a chapter on knowledge, obtaining knowledge before speaking and acting. You see, because if you don't have knowledge, then what you say and what you do will not be straight and upright. So the first slide, if we can go to, what we want to cover this evening, inshallah, are the following questions. These are just some of the questions that we want to address, inshallah. One is, what do we mean when we use the terms good and evil? It's an important issue. We have to clarify meanings, and then what are the origins of the problem of evil? So kind of go into why are we even talking about this, or why has it been discussed and addressed, and why are we talking about it in our times? And what do we mean when we use the term good and evil? That's kind of a similar as the first. And how do atheists use the existence of evil to argue against the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So we want to look at the syllogism that they use in order to, and it's a representative syllogism that and Sheikh No has it in his essay, so we'll look at that. And basically that syllogism, it's representative of all the major arguments that take place in this discussion on evil, and so if we can get that syllogism down and break it down and kind of study it this evening, that'll a lot of our that we find ourselves in. And of good and evil relate to the acts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then why does evil occur? And so first thing is, I guess I would actually probably want to start off with is, so these are some of the questions. They're not in order, but we want to get some of these main questions answered before we leave this evening. So it's in chronological order. So let's start with the kind of historical, if we can go to the next slide, what didn't people have to say about evil and its relationship to the world? And then we'll get to the syllogism and then how we define good and evil, and after that, inshallah. Any suggestions to alter the course for this? If you have the Google Maps, we can find out where else to go, inshallah. Okay, so this is just a rundown of things. Is that so you can see the various ideas that people have on evil, and so the view is that evil is a privation or negation of good. So it's kind of like this absence theory, that where there's when does evil take place? When there's an absence of good, right? And so here also, and so that evil is only evil set against the greater good as well. So that's a Neoplatonic view. Theodicy and coherentism, that's another position, then that's evil can be understood as part of or in relationship to God's larger plan for the cosmos. And then we're going to talk about what theodicy means as well. Manichaeanism, this is an early attempt to solve, and St. Augustine initially held this view, then he later left it, that good and evil are equal conflicting powers expressing their opposition in human history. So Manichaeism, kind of like you have a God of good and then a God of evil, right? And they are fighting it out, so to speak. And that's why we see good and evil in the world. Pious rationalism, that human reason cannot understand evil, but reason must postulate a God to explain human morality. This is similar to Kant's understanding. Like for him, he believed that the strongest argument for the proof of God was the moral argument. In other words, morality is necessary, and in order for morality to work, and you have to postulate the existence. And all other arguments, the cosmological argument, the design argument, the ontological argument, were all very weak and in Kant's eyes. But he felt that the moral argument was the strongest. And then you have what's called pious fideism. Fideism, anybody know what that means? A lot of times, believers fall into category. So fideism or fideistic approach is that if someone were to ask you for a reason for something, you'll quote a verse of the Quran, or you'll quote a hadith, and that's it. But it's kind of like this, why are you doing this? God said so, and that's it. That's kind of a fideistic reasoning. And so we can't understand evil, so we just have to trust, God said it occurred, and we don't ask any questions about it. This is kind of this type of response to it. Pessimism, that evil is real, but the world doesn't make sense, nor can it be understood anyway. So let's just not bother with, we can't understand the world. So it's kind of a pessimistic approach to it. And then non-existence, right? Evil does not actually exist. Rather, human beings project their own subjective disapproval onto events and actions. So evil has no ontological status. In fact, it just doesn't exist. That human beings have created these categories, and all evil. When we use the word evil, it represents our our disapproval of a particular act, and when we use the word good, it represents our approval of a particular act. So in reality, it doesn't exist, though. All it just represents is our approval or disapproval of events and actions. This is kind of just, so you see here, all of these things have been offered and all of these things have been discussed in the past. And this is I just wanted to quickly go over this to show you that this is not, we're not discussing this out of a vacuum. This is something that human beings have taken seriously for a variety of reasons and given various answers throughout history. This is part of a longer conversation that's taken place. And it's a conversation in the West that has not seen or witnessed, Muslims being part of that conversation. And I think we should. We should definitely be part of that conversation. I think what we bring to the table in the larger picture, is something unique, and it solves a lot of problems that many of these that have many different positions in the West, and philosophers and theologians have held, that are problematic in the end. So it's something, hopefully, that we should carry on these conversations with when we go to our college, when we go meet our colleagues at work, and visit different faith groups. Hopefully, towards that end, inshallah, it will work. So theodicy, what do we mean by that? It's a term that Leibniz, he's a 18th century theologian, and he's the one who coined the term. From its origins are from Greek, so theos, which is God, and and then daiki, which is righteous. So the whole purpose, when we say theodicy, what they mean by this word is that theodicy is an attempt to justify the actions of God in the light of evil. So the evil that we see in the world, how do we justify God's actions and maintain our belief in God in light of evil, or in light of the evil that we see in our world? So that's what theodicy means. So it's kind of like a justification in that sense. And then and some of the justifications are pretty elaborate, some of them are not. But why does God allow suffering, or how do we maintain God is good, right? In light of the evil that we see in the world, and so this leads us with. So obviously this problem, 1716 is when Leibniz is around. It existed before him, and but he had a particular attempt, and one of the book on this issue, and then he called the Best of All Possible Worlds, which is very similar to Imam Ghazali's. He had a statement in the Ihya in Kitab al-Tawakkul where he said, radiyallahu anhu, that imkani or ahsanu mimma kan, or abda'u, depending on the riwayah, that there's nothing in the realm of possibilities, laysa fil imkani, or in abda'u mimma kan, more wondrous and than what is, meaning in this current existence. And it's a really deep statement, actually. It's a very profound statement, and it's a statement that some ulama have taken issue with it historically because they understood it in a particular manner. Even in the Imam's lifetime, it caused some conversations to start, and he dictated certain objections that people had to the Ihya, and one of the topics he addressed was his statement, laysa fil imkani abda'u mimma kan. And so even in his own time, this was a statement that required clarification. It wasn't something that was straightforward. But he died in 1111, right? And so 600 years later, we're seeing the West kind of come up with, or people in the West come up with a similar understanding, although it's different when you look at it. So what is the problem here, right? What is the problem? That's something to look into. So let's look at the syllogism that if you take a philosophy 101 class, or you take a, hello, I'm your neighborhood atheist, here's why I don't believe in your God. And what will they give you? Most likely it's something in the form of the following, the syllogism. So one is, you believers, you say God is almighty, and you also say he's a just God. And then you also say he's a good God. All right, and keep in mind, I'm not saying this is how Muslims would frame it. I'm just giving you in our context, in the Western context, this is how this problem is framed. So when we're trying to say, why is this a problem? Well, this is why. And so this is important to keep in mind. So far, there's nothing wrong. God is almighty. I think we can all agree upon that. God is just. It sounds good to me as well. That's not something foreign to us as Muslims. God is good. And Al-Khair. I don't think that's one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Khair. I haven't encountered that, but that doesn't mean anything. I've encountered much. But let's go with it right now. Let's just say, yeah, why not? God is good, inshallah, So if this is all true, if we're saying premise 1 and premise 2 are true, are true, then someone who's just, right, and someone who's good would not allow evil and suffering and evil, if he could prevent them, right? If he could prevent them. So the idea here is that, well, why? In other words, if someone were to be suffering, and some evil were to occur in this world, if that God or that person, let's say right now, that being, is just and good, the reason why they're mentioning Almighty, because someone can say, well, I don't have the power or the capability to remove this evil, so I'm not really responsible. But here we're saying God is almighty, right? And God is just and good. So someone who has these three qualities would not allow for suffering and evil to take place. They would against it, so to speak, right? They would not allow for it to take place. But wait, we see evil in the world. We see suffering in the world. This is the same just God who's supposed to have created this world. This is the God who's supposed to have created this world. This is the same good God who's supposed to have created this world. So what's going on here? Well, there's two possibilities. This is what's called the logical problem of evil, right? There's two. One, either God cannot, he is just and good, but he's not almighty. He's not, doesn't have qudra, right? He doesn't have, so he's not able to prevent that good, or prevent that evil from taking place, right? That's one possibility. So either premise one is false, right? Or premise two is false. He's not a good God. He's not just. And that's why he's going to allow this evil to occur and create evil, and so it can take place. And because the fact is, we do see evil and we see suffering in the world, right? And so that's a premise that's a given. It's a fact. So how do we explain it then, in the light of an almighty, just, and good God? So I don't think as a Muslim we would say God is not almighty. We would definitely agree with that. And we would also claim that Allah subhanahu, see, one of his names, an attribute is al-adl, that he is just, right? So that is a name, and so we would maintain that. We wouldn't say that he's an unjust God. وَمَا رَبُّكَ بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ, as well as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that your Lord is not someone who does wrongdoing to any of his servants. So we would definitely, the Quran explicitly states that. So how do we understand this issue here? Okay, any answers? Sheikh Faraz, who should give the answer? You should choose.
They'll raise their hand.
They will? Oh, so we'll wait for answers. One time I was teaching, and the principal, he walked into one of my classes, my biology. He was observing me. And I did the same thing. I posed a question to my students, and I was waiting for an answer. In my mind, from my perspective as a teacher, I waited, I thought I waited like for eons. Like, this is embarrassing. The principal's in my room, and none of my students, they're not saying anything, and I'm like, oh God, what have I been teaching them all semester? And so, then one student, alhamdulillah, he, gave the answer, and or he attempted to give the answer, and it was a wrong answer. I'm like, oh, it can't get any worse than this, But when I was meeting with my principal, and he's giving me feedback, he was like, Omar, how long did you wait? You asked the question, and the time, and the time you received an answer. And I told him, I waited probably about 5 minutes. And he's like, no, because you only waited like 20 seconds. Right, because in my mind it was like extremely long, span of time as a teacher, right? But when he was sitting down observing, he goes, you have to wait longer. So we can wait longer, inshallah. Yes, sir.
I don't know, but it's want to understand something better. I understand when you said God is almighty, what it means, but when you said God is just, what does it mean by just?
Okay. Good question. What does God mean when he says he's just? Who can answer that question? That's the easy way to get away from this, right? Just defer the question to others. No, we won't do that. We'll provide answers, inshallah. Can we hold off on that question? Let's go back to the one that I asked about. Any possible suggestions here? Let's just at least get. Yes, sir.
Good and evil don't relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So God is good with you.
Okay. So one answer here is that good and evil as categories or descriptions of acts do not relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so to describe God as good would not be correct. So we as a Muslim would disagree with that part of the syllogism. You think, okay, so that's one possible answer. Normally what I do, I ask somebody who agrees or disagrees with her. Yes?
If God is almighty, then he gets to decide what's just and what's good. Like we can't question, like how, with our limited understanding, how can we decide what is just from our limited knowledge?
Okay. So when we use the word just, so how is that then? Okay, that's good. So how would that, let's take it one step further to demonstrate how that would be a problem. How would, yeah, I think you're on the right track here.
So, for example, even in the stories of the Quran, when we learn that, you know, what Musa thinks is, what Musa thinks is, you know, an evil, a good act. So,
Speaking of in Surah Al-Kahf,
right.
we'll say Nakhidr alayhi salam, okay.
So what we may see as evil,
Mhm.
quote unquote. We don't have all knowledge. We can't see what's happened before, what will happen in the future. We are not almighty.
Okay.
Almighty in that, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a human, we cannot wrap their mind around a concept that is a universal truth.
Yeah. No, very good. I mean, I think that's something that is important to pay attention to, that when we're using these words just, and we're using the word good, what concepts are we attaching to these words, right? And that's why, you know, because how we're using these words, just and good, do they apply, you know, or do we have the same concept? That's the first thing. And are our concepts of these words correct concepts? And then do they apply to us as they do to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? These are very important, you know, things, because there's a principle the ulama mention as a very, very useful principle and very important principle, and that is that they say, حُكْمُ الشَّيْء فَرْعٌ عَنْ تَصَوُّرِهِ. I'm sure Shaykh Farad has mentioned it numerous times. Is that when you know, when you make a judgment regarding something, when you make a judgment here, all right, and a judgment is إِثْبَاتُ أَمْرٍ لِأَمْرٍ أَوْ نَفْيُهُ. It's to affirm something or to deny something. It's an affirmation or a denial. When you make that judgment, that is that is derived from, or is intrinsically linked to, the concept of that thing. So the concept you have of a particular object or a particular idea, the idea that you have influences or directly relates to the judgment you make about that idea. So if I were to say that, you know, if I were to use these terms that God is just, well, first I have to have an understanding, a tasawwur, an apprehension of when I use the word God, what do I mean? Then I have to have another. See, here I'm saying God is just. I'm affirming justness, right? Or I'm predicating that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to God. I have to have first an understanding of God, then an understanding of what just is. I have to have this tasawwur first. Then I can make the hukm. Then I can say God is just or God is not just. But first I have to have a concept of what does the word just mean and the term God here mean, right? And depending on how I define them, I will either say, you know, God is or God is not just. You see? So hukm an tasawwurihi is an extremely important principle. So you always want to ask, well, what do you mean by this, right? And then you'll be in the level of tasawwur in that world. And so this is all really good. Everything that you're asking, you know, what do we mean by just? What do we mean by goodness? So let's talk about this. What do we mean by the word evil? Oh, it's a question in the back.
I think based on like your argument, it sounds like you're implying that just is heavily used, and I don't think that the definition of just necessarily has a understanding. So
That's very good, mashallah. Yeah, and so, but in their understanding of justice, it has to be immediate. Yeah, So if they don't see, if they're expecting something immediate as like a response to something, and they don't see it, so this must be an unjust. Well, that's it. Why does that quality of being immediate have to be there when we think of justice? That's a really good observation in that. So let's talk about this, and let's see how are the words good and evil used. So he talks about this in his. So we have the syllogism. So let's try to break it down now, inshallah. So Imam Ghazali talks about in his Mustasfa. He says when we say, the words good and evil. So in Arabic, or in the way it's used in our intellectual tradition, is the words for good is called husn, al-husn, right? Ha, sin, nun. And the word for evil is qabih, right? Qaf, ba, ya, ha. So we say hada hasanun, right? Or hada qabihun, right? And this is ism fa'il of that. So this is we say hada hasanun, this is good. Hada qabihun, this is evil. What's really interesting here is the word hasan. What is that related to? You guys are all Arabists, right? Yeah, good. Hasan, right? Husn. It has this. It's related to this idea of. So, what's good is. It's also beautiful, right? Now we don't mean beautiful what you see in, necessarily in movies and cover of magazines and all that. That's not our concept of beauty. Although some people may think that. So all of Hollywood is good. I wouldn't see how you can come to that conclusion. No, I wouldn't say that. But but in our understanding of good, right, there is also this understanding of what's beautiful. Right, beauty is linked with this, and it's really beautiful, mashallah. So also qabih, right? When we say evil, qabh, that means it's ugly. It had a shay qabih. It's something that you find to be, there's an element of ugliness, right, in something that's evil. And you might even see this sometimes, when you read fiction, and if you might see a movie or something, you'll see like when they always have the villain of the, or some evil character, he's always dark and, living in a very dirty place. So that's kind of something that exists in the Western tradition too, that idea. But I don't know if they make that very explicit. But for us, I think there's an explicit relationship between goodness and beauty, and evilness and ugliness as well. So these are the two terms that we use. And so, but what do we mean by them? Well, Imam Ghazali discusses the mean here. And so the first way we use the word good and evil, husn and qabih, hada hasanun, and so hasan and qabih, is he says that this is a very well-known and popular way of using that. And he says here that all acts can either be categorized sinners in three ways. You can have an act. So you have an act agent, right? The doer of the act. Let's use the word agent for that. It's easier for me. So you have an act, and then you have an agent, right? And so goodness the word good and evil can be used in looking at describing that relationship between the agent and the act. So that act which is in agreement with the motivations and the goal of the purpose or the interests of the agent, any act that's in agreement with the interest of the agent is termed good. So if a particular person they're thirsty and they want to get some water or drink some tea, this is good. My act of drinking is good. Why? Because it's in agreement with my interests, right? So this would be considered good. If you had money and in a purse or something, and then got stolen, right? Or someone came and stole that money from you, that would be considered evil. Why? Because that act is not in agreement with your interests and the agent's interests, right? So that's one way. So we say something is good, ma yuwafiqu gharad al-fa'ili. So what is in agreement with the interests or the goal or the interests of the agent here. That's what's good. What's evil is the opposite. إِلَى مَا يُخَالِف, what is contrary to the interests of the agent. An act that is contrary to the interests of an agent. That's evil. And then you have a third category, and it's an act that is neither in agreement, nor is it contrary or in disagreement with the interest of the agent. And that's called abath, something that's just futile, right? Just related to that particular act. So, so how would we, who can summarize really quickly what are the, how would, according to this first usage, how we understand good and evil? It's really quick. Yes? It is what? It's interest-based. How so? Okay. It's futile, right? Just it has no value per se, right? An act. So that's good. That's the first way of understanding this. What's the problem with that? A problem with that definition of good and evil?
Well, the same act can be seen in different ways by two different agents.
How so?
Well, the thief, the money that's in his interest.
So that's good.
That's good for him, but the person from whom it's stolen, that's bad for him.
Yeah. So there's a problem here then, right? With this way of defining good and evil in that way. That's a problem, and we'll put the problem on this side of the table for now, okay? And we'll get to it, inshallah. That's good. Now, is there something wrong with, so Imam Ghazali says, he continues, he says, وَعَلَى هَذَا الْإِصْطِلَاحِ إِذَا كَانَ الْفِعْلُ مُوَافِقًا لِشَخْصٍ مُخَالِفًا لِلْآخِرِ, kind of what you're saying, that if an act is in agreement with one person's interest and contrary to another person's interest, فَهُوَ حَسَنٌ فِي حَقِّ مَنْ يُوَافِقُ فِي حَقِّ مَنْ يُخَالِفُ. And that's what exactly Badr was saying here, that it's good in regards to the person's, the person who this act is in agreement with their interest in evil, and when taken from the perspective of the person, the agent who the act is contrary to their interests. حتى إن قتل الملك الكبير يكون حسنا في حق أعدائه قبيحا في حق أوليائه. So he gives an example of that if there's a great king, and if he was killed, right, and then that would be considered good from the perspective of his enemies, but it would be considered evil from the perspective of his supporters and his supporters. So you have this situation here that gets created. Now, and he says some people who define good and evil solely in these terms, right, and keep in mind my word here, solely in this term, this is their only definition of good and evil, they will, they have no problems in, saying that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does evil acts. His act is evil. His act. So, that's, and then Imam Ghazali says a lot of them, they would actually, this was something the Prophet ﷺ in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ told us not to do, لا تسبوا الدهر, right, that do not curse time, right, and so they would do that because they would consider that time brings with it evil and bad things, so they would end up doing that. And so the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim that لا تسبوا الدهر فإن الله هو الدهر, right, do not curse time, for indeed Allah himself is ad-dahr, time. Now, there's a whole discussion on what that means, which we won't get into in this place. Now, so this also, so now the key thing over here to keep in mind is that according to this definition of good and evil, the word is that they're relative. So, this is a relative definition of good and evil. Good relative to one particular agent, and evil relative to another. So this is a relative definition of good and evil over here. He says, huma amrani idafiyan, right, and in that case. So they're relative matters. The other definition of good and evil that he brings here, and the other fuqaha bring, is that, now, we'll go through all three and then we'll talk about it, another aspect of it. The other definition is that anything that brings blame, an act that brings blame, right, and blame immediately. Like the moment an agent does an act, it will bring to that agent blame immediately, and in the hereafter they'll be punished for that particular act. If there's an act like that, then that's called evil. Okay, and if there's an act which a person does which brings them praise, right? And if an act that brings them praise, then that is an act, and then reward in the hereafter, then that is an act that's considered good. So that's another definition of good and evil as well. Now the key thing here is who's defining what people get. Whether they get praised, an agent gets praised or blamed for a particular act. So here, if the key thing to keep in mind is that according to this definition, it's only the Sharia, right, through revelation, in other words, that we can know a particular act, and whether it's a praiseworthy act or whether it's a blameworthy or an evil act. So good and evil in this sense, right, are defined as based on revelation. So it's not based merely on what an agent's interests are. It's based on revelation. So, for example, like performing an act of, when we say an act of disobedience brings you punishment, this is evil. So an act of disobedience is evil, and it's an act that brings the agent punishment. This is fine, and this is a good definition of evil, but this, as long as it's only based, who defines good and evil here, or who defines punishment and reward, it's based on revelation. And so like praying 5 times a day, this will be considered a good act, right? But our intellects cannot discern this act. Our intellects cannot discern that this is a good act, prayer, for example. So if we were to say that prayer is, praying an obligatory prayer is a good act and it will bring you reward and praise in this world and reward in the hereafter, the only way we can arrive at that conclusion, at that hukam, right, is through revelation. The intellect alone cannot affirm nor deny it. It's kind of indifferent. It can say it's possible it can be praised, for praying and rewarded. It's possible there's punishment that can be there. What comes and tells us that this act, praying Fajr prayer, for example, is rewarded, is revelation. And so in this case, is good and evil relative from this point of view? It wouldn't be. It kind of has an objective quality to good and evil, right? So this is another definition here, is that when we say something is good and we say the agent gets praised for it, right, the second definition is we say it's good on the basis of revelation, on the basis of Sharia, or and this is known through prophets as well, of course. So it's actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is telling us that this act is good and this act is evil. And it's not based on, in this case, a person's interests. And it's not actually based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's interests as well. So this is an important point here. All of the ahkam that we can talk about, or that we know when we apply, when we say that they're good and they're evil and that there's a benefit, in everything that we apply and everything that we do. So for example, if we were to pray, if we were to fast, when we do Hajj, when we do, stay away, when we acquire all of the virtues, when we divest ourselves of all vice, there's wisdom, first of all, in all of this, whether we know it or not, whether we're aware of that wisdom or that specific wisdom behind a particular act, there is. We may or may not know it, but our not knowing the specific wisdom behind why we do tawaf 7 times around the Kaaba, or why is Maghrib 3 times, 3 rak'ahs instead of 4, that particular wisdom we may not know, but that doesn't mean that no wisdom exists behind it. And that doesn't mean that there's no benefit, no good behind it being 3 and Maghrib being 3 and Fajr being 2. I'm just giving examples of this. So there is good behind it. Whether we know it or not, that's a different question. But us not knowing the good behind it doesn't mean that good doesn't exist behind it. Same thing with acts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited, and according to the second definition, are evil. We may or may not know what that evil is, right? But there is evil act, and us staying away from that act, right, is in our benefit and interest as well. Now, parallel to this concept is that all of the benefits of a particular act and everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated for us to do, none of this benefit, none of the benefit interests behind this have to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't, benefit from us praying, right? He doesn't benefit from us, fasting or anything like this. This is all a benefit that refers to us as human beings on this earth, right? And in the hereafter as well. So that's important to keep in mind here. So when we say something is good and it has, benefit to us, that benefit is not that, it's really restricted to us as human beings. Not that that benefit, for example, goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He benefits from us praying. No. He doesn't benefit at all from us praying. It's really, it all goes back to us. So these are the definitions here that we have of good and evil that, now. And then another understanding of good and evil too are what we call qualities of perfection and qualities of deficiency. So, and so if we consider somebody, what we consider someone to be handsome, right? Tall, dark, rich, consider someone to be handsome, or someone to be, if we consider a particular woman to be beautiful, those qualities, we said, we use the word good for that, right? And we use the word bad or evil, for certain things as well, of those qualities. So for example, so any attributes of perfection, these are moral qualities we're talking about here, like so virtues and vice as well. That's also something that is defined according to the Sharia. Now, can the intellect know what's good and evil? This is an important question. And the gist of it is that if we define good and evil defined according to our first definition, that good is what is of the agent and evil is what is contrary to the interest of the agent, that we can know through our intellects. Our intellects can discern that pretty clearly. And now what about attributes of, qualities of perfection and then qualities that, exhibit deficiency, vice? That we can also know through the intellect. So we can know, for example, that, someone who is, that we should, someone is being harmed on the street, we should go and help that person if they're being attacked on the street. That's the person who does that, we consider that something that's good, right? And so that we don't need a prophet, or revelation to inform us that that's a good act or a bad act. We know that through, pretty much agreement of human beings on these type of issues. So the intellect can determine that. Good and evil as defined according to the Sharia, for example, prayer is a good act. Zakat is a good act, right? Adultery is an evil act, right? Riba is evil. That can only be known through prophets. So without prophets, without the aid of revelation, human beings would never be able to arrive at the conclusion that interest is something that is considered a sin, that adultery is considered a sin. And and if you ever tried to talk to people like sometimes I have to talk to a lot of young students, and if they don't believe in revelation, it's very difficult. I taught at a non-Muslim school for a number of years, and it's extremely difficult to convince them that adultery is something that is wrong and they should wait until they get married to carry out such an act. Because there's no rational, at least from my, I haven't heard of one, there's no purely rational argument that will convince someone that adultery, they can say, well, this is a psychological harm, this is, physiological, you're going to end up with this, and that's fine, but those are all probable harms. And a kid, especially at that age, well, that's not going to happen to me, all right? Those are just statistics, and I'm not one of those numbers of, So it's really difficult, and you see here it really does take the belief in prophets, and it takes the aid of revelation to make sure that these arguments are, in the end of the day, convincing to people. So that can only be known through the Sharia, meaning through revelation. We can know these things of good and evil, right? Meaning of prayer, of fasting, of and what the rewards related to each act and the punishments related to each act are. That's Sharia based only. That's only through revelation that we can know. So those are the three things of good and evil. And let's take some questions. Yes?
What role does fitra play in that, like the natural disposition in terms of understanding?
Yeah, fitra, very good question. So fitra, there's a lot of different understandings of fitra. Fitra, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word once in the Quran. And فطرة الله التي فطر عليها الناس لا تبديل لخلق الله. And so the word basically means what is this natural disposition, this innate disposition that all human beings are created upon. The kullu mawludin, as the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitra. So abawah yuhawidanihi or yunassiranihi or yumajjisanihi, and in one riwayah in Sahih Muslim, وَإِذَا كَانَ مُسْلِمَيْن فَمُسْلِمٌ, that if both parents were Muslim, then the child will be Muslim. So every human being is born in accordance with this fitra, with this natural disposition. And it's a child's parents who either make that person a Jew or a Christian or a Magian, and if both parents are Muslim, then that child will also be Muslim. So fitra here, the question comes up is what knowledge is, what is the epistemological value of fitra? What knowledge does it contain? And what the ulama have mentioned here is what we call in logic al-awwaliyat, or first principles, such as like every cause has an effect, right? A principle like at-tarjih bila murajjih muhal, that if there's two possibilities, and such as existence and non-existence of an object, and for it to exist without an agent to determine its existence, that's impossible. So something to exist by itself, spontaneous generation, that's considered rationally impossible. That is known by the fitrah. Those are all those first principles. Those are fitrah. Details of Islam, because some people think fitrah is Islam, and that's why a person's a revert and not a convert. I personally don't buy that argument, but that's a different issue. What I understand by the ulama who say that they mean it's that fitrah is Islam, and there are some ulama who mention that, but meaning that the fitrah is in conformity and in total agreement with the religions and of Islam and the teachings of Islam. And that's why you'll see the Prophet ﷺ mention in hadiths that khamsun min al-fitra, 5 things are from the fitrah. Sometimes it's 10 things are from the fitrah, like cutting your nails, trimming your mustache, right? Doesn't mean that the fitrah knows to trim the nails, right, and all of these things. No, those detailed ahkam are not from the fitrah. Rather, what is from the fitrah is that these acts are in conformity and in agreement with the fitrah. You see here? So in other words, that if a person were to be, so the fitrah, when they say it's the fitrah is Islam, what they mean here is that when the religion of Islam and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ are presented to a person, it's very easy for them to accept it because it's in conformity with the nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created every human being with. In other words, there's a propensity to accept, so we don't believe that we're like in John Locke, he held that human nature is a blank slate, right? And so we don't hold that position. Rather, we hold that our human nature is created with a propensity to accept the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the teachings of Islam. So it's in a conformity with that. That's just kind of a summation of the view on fitrah. So here, fitrah, does it have a role to play in terms of what's good and what's evil and all of that? Not the details. Not the details, but what the teachings of Islam, in the sense that if you were to say that riba is prohibited and adultery is prohibited, the fitra would not find that to be problematic. It would accept it with ease, right? Now, can fitras become corrupted or not? That's another discussion, but the idea here is that it's really external factors that affect the fitra. Because if you look in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, فَأَبَوَاهُ يُهَوِّدَانِهِ. So the fitra is there. He mentioned all external factors that influence the fitra of a child and of a human being. So it's all external factors that impact the fitra. The fitra, if it were left to itself, it doesn't mean that it'll know what the sunnah is and all of these things. No. But the fitra has a propensity to believe in the oneness of God. So shirk and all of these polytheisms and all these other understandings of God will be something alien to the fitra. It won't be comfortable with it. But if the person's environment is such, these external factors in their environment influence the fitra such that it can kind of cover the fitra from being expressed, and so it could, as one sheikh said, warp the fitra in that sense, you know. So, and it could from being expressed. And we'll find sometimes, and we find people who find sometimes the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ to be strange, right? And because they've been so, they haven't, their fitra has been, you know, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, you know, has been covering their fitra, and so the fitra for themselves, these people, is something strange, because they've been kind of distanced from their nature. Allahu A'lam. Aywa. Any other questions before we get to? Yes.
You mentioned that there's wisdom in all of the active ingredients, even if we don't know the wisdom. Does that mean that that there's a reason why, for example, Maghrib prayer is made 3 rak'ahs as opposed to 4?
Absolutely. There is a reason why. And now, do I know it? No. Maybe Shaykh Faraz. Allah inspired him. Can people know it? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspire people? Yes. You know, many of the great awliya have said statements as to why, but they will never, mashallah, they show proper adab. They will never say this is the reason why Maghrib is 3, why Dhuhr is 4, you know. And it's important not to, you know, because some people will take that reason and they'll think that this is the reason why, you know, and then other parts of the deen won't make sense. And so this is something that was called dhanni. It's just probable that this is the reason why. But they will never say that this is the reason why, unless the Prophet ﷺ has told us. And even then, that's one of the multiple wisdoms that the Prophet ﷺ has disclosed to us. You see? So, yes, there is a wisdom in every single hukum of Allah. There is a wisdom, and there is masalih, there's interest, there's benefit in that. And there's mafasid that are being, that we're being protected from. There's harm that we're being protected from. So, whether we know it or not, though. Yeah. Yes? Great question. They're ands. Yeah. No. But to know ultimately what is good and evil, I mean, we have to know the Sharia then, right? So if something's in conformity with the Sharia, then if something that we define as good and evil, we see to be that something that's good and evil, or like the agent's interests, if his or her interests are in line with the Sharia, then that's good. If his or her interests are not in line with the Sharia, then that's going to be evil. All right? So, but we have to be also careful to know that, you know, something may be in line with our interests, but that may not, we may consider it good. So someone got into a particular med school program, they think that's good for them. And so they accept it, right? And that's fine, but then is it really good for them? Right? Maybe they accepted the program and their life went down, you know, down the drain after that or something, you know. So that's, you know, this is really, that's why it's relative to that person. In reality, it may or may not be good for that person. You see? And that's really what time will tell. So if we look at if we look at on page 4 of Sheikh No's essay, we'll read this and we'll see kind of how he talks about the wisdom. That's kind of what's happening. That's really what's important here. So he says here is that he said Shaykh Abdul Rahman taught that the divine names vie over existent things to manifest their implications in them. So everything that we see here, everything in the entire order of creation, manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine names. Remember we spoke about yesterday when we say Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, that salah is a tajalli. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disclosing himself. And this is what it is. So all of creation is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disclosing himself through his divine names. His essence is not disclosed, but through his divine names. So he gives a good example here. He says, consider the example of a young man from a good family who falls in with bad company and drifts into their way of seeing and doing things under the influence of al-khafid. So when this man, he's doing things that's really bad and everything, then the name al-khafid, the lower, right, that's being manifested. And finally al-mudhil, right, the abaser. That's the divine name that's being manifested here. Until the day comes when he can sink no lower and disgusts even himself. Then the name at-tawwab, relenter, deploys. So the person does tawbah, now al-mudhil and are no longer being manifested in that particular person, but now is at-tawwab. That's what's being represented. A-relenter, and he remembers how he was, sees what he has become, and finds himself ashamed before his Maker, to whom he repents. The days and weeks see him improve until the implications of al-rafi', he who raises. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is raising him, his low levels that he used to be. So now it's the name, at-tawwab was there, and then at-tawwab turned into al-rafi', the one who raises. And he seeks better company, unplugs from bad old ways, and passes into the sphere of al-wadud. So he keeps on rising and rising and rising. The name al-wadud manifests, the solicitous and tender. Then to al-karim, the all-generous, and so forth. So this is an example of how the names are being manifested. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names and attributes are being manifested in all of creation times. And that's how we look at what's going on into the world. And so he says here the name al-musawwir, for example, the bestower of forms, the fashioner, the ingrainer, the organizer, manifests its implications in all existence, while al-warith, the inheritor, remains after implications of the former have been lifted to any particular existence, and it has annihilated, dispersed. The name al-muqaddam makes one existence precede another, in works, or in rank, or in time of appearance, while al-mu'akhir, the delayer, the demoter, postpones existence and events until after others, or keeps them back, or lowers them. And so, here we see like the idea here, and it's very important, is that when we're looking at our reality, it's not linear, in the sense that we are, we see act A, we judge it to be good or evil when we look at a particular act, because we can never isolate that act from its particular context. And I think that was alluding to what some of the sisters were saying before, is that the act itself, you see how it's very complex, right? And reality is much more complicated than we would see. So we can't have this linear approach to reality. We have to say that this is an act, but it exists in a particular context. And unless we fully know that context, we can't really, in reality, judge whether it's good or evil then. Now, we have to go off of our knowledge of our context regarding ourselves. And we're held accountable for the intentions that we make based on our knowledge of that act. But we're not held accountable to know the full reality of a particular act. That only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and has full knowledge of, simply because we lack the knowledge. Simply because we lack the knowledge of that. So when we say things are perfect, we look at the world and we see things, that are evil that are happening, it definitely raises quite a lot of questions. And so Imam Ghazali, when he is speaking about Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim in his book Al-Maqsad Al-Asna. And he's speaking about the names of Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, and he says, Ar-Rahma tastad'i marhuman wa la marhuman illa wa huwa muhtaj. So he says the divine name, mercy, divine mercy necessarily requires a marhuman, an object of divine mercy. And there is no object of divine mercy except that it is in need, is contingent, it has a particular need. وَالَّذِي يَنْقَضِي بِسَبَبِهِ حَاجَةُ الْمُحْتَاجِ بِقَصْدٍ وَإِرَادَةٍ وَعِنَايَةٍ بِالْمُحْتَاجِ لَا يُسَمَّى رَحِيمًا وَالَّذِي يُرِيدُ قَضَاءَ حَاجَةِ الْمُحْتَاج وَلَا يَقْدِرُ إن كان قادرا على قضائها لم يسمى رحيما إذ لو تمت الإرادة لوفى بها وإن كان عاجزا فقد يسمى رحيما باعتبار ما اعتبره من الرقة ولكنه ناقص. He says وإنما الرحمة إفادة الخير على المحتاجين وإرادته لهم عناية بهم. So he says that what's complete and perfect mercy then is for the bestowing of goodness and fulfilling the needs of those objects that are in need, and the will to have care and show providence to those particular objects of need. That's what tamma. And rahma al-amma hiya allati tatanawal al-mustahiq wa ghayr al-mustahiq. Right? And so you have rahma at-tamma, which if there's an object of mercy, and he says that object of mercy necessarily has a particular need. So rahma at-tamma is the rahma that fulfills the need of that particular object. Rahma al-amma fulfills the need of those who are worthy and deserve their needs to be fulfilled, and those who do not deserve to have their needs fulfilled. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahma, he says, wa rahma tamma wa amma. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is complete, tamma, and it's amma, it's all encompassing. Now, and then he says here, he continues to talk, and he says, وَلَيْسَ فِي الْوُجُودِ شَرٌ إِلَّا وَفِي ضِمْنِهِ خَيْرٌ. That, and he said there's nothing in existence, right? There's no exist except that in that evil there is goodness. And that's an important principle to keep in mind. There's nothing, so when we see something as evil, there's nothing in, so every evil has inside of this evil, or underneath it, you could say, or included in it, good. لو رفع ذلك الشر لبطل الخير الذي في ضمنه. Such that if that's the case, that every evil has within it good, then if that evil were to be eliminated, then the good that evil contains would also be eliminated. You see? And then he says, وَحَصَلَ بِبُطْلَانِهِ شَرٌ أَعْظَمْ مِنْ شَرِّ الَّذِي يَتَضَمَّنَهُ. That, and so if that evil were to be removed, then that would result in that goodness not being manifest and not becoming apparent, which is a greater evil, right, than the first evil. فَالْيَدَ الْمُتَآكِلَ قَطُعَهَا شَرٌ فِي الظَّاهِرِ. So if there's a hand that doesn't work, someone has a hand and it's not functioning anymore, and it maybe have gangrene or some disease, that if the hand wasn't cut off, that disease would spread to the entire body. So cutting off that hand, it seems like it's evil and painful, right? And apparently, وَفِي ضِمْنِهِ الْخَيْرُ الْجَزِيلُ. But cutting off that hand, there is an immense amount of good that will result from that. وَهُوَ سَلَامَةُ الْبَدَنِ. And that's that the rest of the body would end up being preserved. And were he not to cut off his hand, then his entire body would be destroyed, and that's a greater evil, and that's a greater harm that would result from that. Now, and then he says here is that, no. So in other words, then he says that, so cutting off the hand, that's not really what's intended. That's not the goal, of the particular act. The object of the act is really to preserve the body. in cutting off the hand, right? So when we're looking here at what's the intention, he says, وَالْقَطْعُ, he says, فَكَانَتْ السَّلَامَةُ مَطْلُوبًا لِذَاتِهَا أَوَّلًا. So the goal is to preserve the body, right? That's the first objective. وَالْقَطْعُ مَطْلُوبًا لِغَيْرِهِ ثَانِيًا. And cutting off the hand, something that's sought after, but it's secondary, right? And that secondary goal is only sought after in light of the first goal, which is to preserve the entire body. So cutting off the hand is not sought in and of itself. It's only sought in order to preserve the entire body. فَهُمَا دَاخِلًا تَحْتَ الْإِرَادَةِ. But both of those are willed, right? Both cutting off the hand and preserving the entire body come under what's willed. وَلَكِنَّ أَحَدَهُمَا مُرَادٌ لِذَاتِهِ وَالْآخَرُ مُرَادٌ لِغَيْرِهِ. So both are intended, but one is intended in and of itself, and the other one's only intended for extrinsic reasons, right? In light of the primary goal, which is to save the body. Then he says, وَلِأَجْلِهِ قَالَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَزَّ وَجَلَّ سَبَقَتْ رَحْمَتِي غَضَبِي. And this is really beautiful. And we all know the hadith, and it's mentioned in Arba'in Nawawiyya as well, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, رَحْمَتِي غَضَبِي, that my mercy now has outstripped my wrath or my anger. You see here? And so he says, فَغَضَبَهُ إِرَادَتُهُ لِلشَّرِّ. So Allah's wrath and His anger is Him willing the existence of evil. وَالشَّرْ بِإِرَادَتِهِ. So evil comes into existence based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. وَرَحْمَتُهُ إِرَادَتُهُ لِلْخَيْرِ. And His mercy is Him also willing what is good. Because remember, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَأَن تُؤْمِن, in the hadith of Jibreel, وَأن تُؤْمِن بِقَدْرِهِ خَيْرِهِ وَشَرِّهِ. And that you uphold and you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine decree, it's good and it's evil, right? So he says here, is that His wrath and His evil, فَغَضَبَهُ إِرَادَتُهُ لِلشَّرِّ. So the ghadab, His wrath, is Allah's willing evil to take place. وَالشَّرْ بِإِرَادَتِهِ. And the evil taking place is by His will. وَرَحْمَتُهُ إِرَادَتُهُ لِلْخَيْرِ. And His mercy is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willing goodness to come out. وَالْخَيْرُ بِإِرَادَتِهِ. And good comes about by virtue of His will as well. وَلَكِنْ أَرَادَ الْخَيْرَ لِلْخَيْرِ لِنَفْسِهِ. But however, Allah willed good for the sake of good itself. So good is sought after in and of itself. وَأَرَادَ الشَّرْ لَا لِذَاتِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَمَّا فِي ضِمْنِهِ مِنَ الْخَيْرِ. عفوا لِمَا فِي ضِمْنِهِ مِنَ الْخَيْرِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed evil to exist not in and of itself, evil, but only because of the goodness that will result in evil coming about. That this particular evil act, when it was created and it comes about, it results in goodness. That is what is sought after. فَالْخَيْرُ مَقْضِيٌ بِالذَّاتِ. So good is that which is determined due to or in and of itself. That's what is primarily sought after. وَالشَّرُّ مَقْضِيٌ بِالْعَرَضِ. وَكُلْ, right? And then he says, and so then evil is determined بِالْعَرَض, due to a quality that it has that's not inherent in that evil act, rather because of the good that results from that evil. And then he says, وَكُلٌّ بِقَدَرٍ. And both the willing of good and the willing of evil is by Allah's foreordainment, His qadr. وَلَيْسَ فِي ذَلِكَ مَا يُحْمَى أَصْلًا. And none of this entails denying or negating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy at all. So he says, سَبَقَتْ رَحْمَتِي غَضَبِي. You see? So in other words, and this hadith is beautiful because it's affirming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, and it's also affirming His wrath. Both exist, but what exists ontologically prior to each other is His mercy. You see? And in other words, His ghadab, His wrath, does exist, but it exists for the greater good, for the good of His, because there's a greater good that exists, which is His mercy. So that's how we understand this hadith. Sabaqat rahmati ghadabi. It's a very not unique interpretation, but it's an interpretation I haven't found in other commentaries on this. So then he says, فَالْآنْ إِنْ خَطَرَ لَكَ نَوْعًا مِنَ الشَّرِّ لَا تَرَى تَحْتَهُ خَيْرًا أو خطر لك أنه كان تحصيل ذلك الخير ممكنا لا في ضمن الشر فاتهم عقلك القاصر في أحد الخاطرين. So he says here, so now, having said all of this, if a particular evil thought occurred to your mind, right, and in this evil thought, or not just an evil thought, just something evil occurred in the world, in your life, that you found was evil, and you are unable to see any good come out of that evil. He says then, or if you were to think that this good that did occur, he says, أو خطر لك أنه كان تحصيل ذلك الخير ممكنا لا في ضمن الشر, that this good could have been achieved without any evil whatsoever, just without any evil having to occur. Then he says, فَاتَّهِمْ عَقْلَكَ الْقَاصِرِ, right? Then he goes, you should then, you should accuse your deficient intellect, because you're unable. So then don't blame God, or don't blame what's happening in the world. Rather, you should blame the deficiency of your intellect for not being able to perceive what good could possibly result from an evil taking place, or from the idea that this good could have taken place without any evil whatsoever taking place. There was a different way to look at the world. I remember after 9/11 happened, I was listening to NPR, the radio. I don't know, NPR is in Canada. Is it in Canada? Oh, okay, good. So, and they had a rabbi on there, and when he was looking at he was commenting from a theological about 9/11, and he was saying, his response was that I'm angry at God. Literally, he said that, I'm angry at God today. MashaAllah, And so, and I was like, well, this is a pretty bold statement to make. And he goes, how could he allow for such a horrible thing to happen? I'll tell you, he allowed for it, right? There's goodness in there's wisdom in what's going to take place. And so we should, he should, according to Imam Ghazali, he should check his own, intellect, and because it's deficient. He's unable to see this. And he's not even having a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there is going to be some khair that comes out from all of this. And so this is important here, to see that, the idea of having al-husnul dhan billah, of having a good opinion of Allah. And as one sheikh translated, as giving Allah the benefit of the doubt, right? That's so important, because how you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's how you're going to be treated. It's this principle of reciprocity, right? If you believe that there's goodness in this, Allah will show that goodness to you. If you're angry at God, غَيْرُ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, right? Think of how He's going to be treating you then, all throughout your existence. You're going to, and so that's something that, there's this principle of reciprocity, right? The first hadith that every talib, learns and gets ascended in is ar-rahimuna, or yarhamahum ar-rahman, right? That those who are merciful and showing mercy to each other, yarhamahum ar-rahman. Ar-Rahman, the All-Merciful, shows mercy to them. Why? Because they're showing mercy. If you show mercy, then you will be shown mercy, right? Arham man fis sama yarhamhum fil arham man fil ard yarhamhum man fis sama. No, is that the? Yeah. So show mercy to each other on the earth, and then He who is in the sky will show mercy to you. This is the first hadith that all of them learned, and it's there for. And I believe that reason is, this is why you're studying. This is how you are supposed to look at the world. And it's in line, sabaqat rahmati al-ghadabi, right? That it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy precedes and outstrips His wrath. So it's really this whole, the world, we have to see what divine name is taking place. What divine name or names are being manifested at this time. And in your life, there's certain divine names, and other people's lives is different divine names that are taking place. You see? And so it's all, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disclosing himself. The question is, in what name will he be disclosing himself to you and at this point in your life? And that's why you should always have al-husn dhan billah. You should always have a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says here, and so the Shaykh now continues, and he says that an important principle, that there is neither good in the actions of Allah, most blessed and exalted, in respect to his divinity. So when we say, when we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acts, we're not saying that they themselves are good or evil. We can't apply these words to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of good and evil. Rather, he says, for all actions are equal. So from the point of view of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we can use that language, they're all equal. They don't have this quality of good and evil. But then he says, while their levels but differ in respect to created servants. So in respect to creation, that's where good and evil starts to enter into the picture. And this is an important principle, that when we say, if we look at the idea of an act, when we say a certain act is good or a certain act is evil, what we mean here is that if we were to take, for example, the act of walking, right? We just take this act of walking, and a person could be walking. Is good and evil in our conception of walking, the qualities of good and evil? Okay, so good. It depends on where you're going, right? And at the same time, it depends on multiple factors, on the intention of the person as well, right? So it depends on this context. But if we were to strip walking away and just look at walking in and of itself, the essence of walking, and the essence of riding, the essence of sitting, the essence of, just look at these acts, because we use these words all the time. Is good and evil included in our understanding of walking, of sleeping, of riding, of sitting? No, right? Depending on the context, the quality that we bring of good, the quality of evil that we attach to a particular act, that can be taken away, right, from the act of walking, from the act of riding, from the act of sitting, from the act of drinking. All of these acts, you can take the quality of good away from those particular acts. So in other words, good and evil define or do not make up the essence of a particular act. This is according to Ahlul Sunnah theologians, Ash'ari and Maturidi theologians, that good and evil do not make up the particular essence of an act. So if someone were to describe to you writing, what does writing mean? Right, what you're going to say in response to that question is not going to have the idea of good and evil in your response to that question. Say, what do you mean by sitting? And someone says, well, you demonstrate sitting. If you can't define it, you'll demonstrate sitting. Good and evil aren't going to be in that definition of sitting, you see? Now, depending on the context, a person can be walking to the masjid. That's a good act. Well, it depends. Why are they walking to the masjid? Get their money. This guy's going to pay Maghrib prayer. He owed me $5 and I'm going to go and get it. Well, that's not a bad thing either, right? But if somebody's going to the masjid to pray and their intentions are pure and everything, then that we define as good. Now, if someone is going to the masjid to carry on a debate that they had and, beat the guy up, for saying words to him because he knows he's going to see him at Maghrib prayer, well, that's a bad act. But they're still walking and they're still going to the masjid, the same place. But the context, right, the greater picture determines whether that act of walking to the masjid is good or it's evil. And depending on, that context, we will ascribe those qualities of good and evil. But in the act itself, when we think of what do we mean when someone is walking, what do we mean when someone is sitting down or riding or eating, when we define those concepts and we talk about them, the qualities of good and evil don't come up. So that's what we say, that good and evil do not make up the essence of any particular act. Rather, they're considered accidental, or they're considered accidents of a particular act. They don't make up the essence of a particular act. What about lying? Like,
Like if you're trying to protect someone from someone who wants to harm them, or if you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, and you know what I mean? Like there's
yeah.
certain
So the Prophet ﷺ has told us, Imam Ghazali explicitly states lying is neither good or bad, right? Even according to Sharia, it's not, in its essence, right, it's not good or bad. Depending on the context, it can be good, and depending on the context, it can be an evil act, lying. And those contexts and those, you know, those situations are discussed in the hadith, and then the hukam is given from the Sharia based on those contexts of that. Is that clear about the concept of, you know, when we think about a particular act, the qualities of good and evil are accidental to the essence, meaning that they don't compose or form the essence of a particular act. They're accidents. They're qualities that can, you know, be present or not be present depending on the context. And based off of that, determine an act if it's good or evil from that. Yes? Mm-hmm. My understanding of the statement is not that you sit there and for hours and come up with, you know, all the possible, you know, reasons and good that can come about. I mean, rather the way we live our lives is that, you know, that we believe in this principle that goodness will eventually arrive. Now the question is that when does it come? When will we know the goodness, or when will that good become manifest? That we don't know. You know, it can be in our lifetimes, it can be in the hereafter. We don't know when that will take place, you know, or when the goodness will be disclosed. In our spiritual state and our relationship with Allah, Allah can disclose to certain people the goodness of an act and not disclose it to others, absolutely. But that's not something that, when he means you're deficient in, or you should, you know, you should suspect your reasoning, your aql, your intellect here, meaning that if you can't believe that goodness will occur, right, from an evil act, that's something that is very rational to uphold, and if you can't get that, that means there's something in your intellect that you have to fix and think about that. But whether a particular act is good or not, that is something that, you know, whether, you have to keep in mind, we're not talking about a particular act that, you know, is bad. So like, let's take, for example, 9/11. What happened there was absolutely evil. It was wrong. It was on so many levels. We're not saying that what happened in 9/11, for example, is good. We're saying that through this evil act, and we treat it as an act, there will be khayr coming from it, inshallah. So like if someone, let's say, la samahallah, someone were to be killed unjustly, we say that that's wrong, and the person's considered a criminal, and we treat them as a criminal, and there will be whatever punishment they deserve, they get. But through that evil act, you know, inshallah, there will be goodness that will come about from that. Now, that could be goodness that appears in this world, or it could be goodness that comes out in the hereafter. That all depends on the situation. But we still, I want to make sure that we're not saying that, you know, that the person killing someone is good in any way. No, it's evil, but from that, what results from that, inshallah, there will be good that comes about from that. And that's what we want to be clear, make sure we're clear on this. Yes? Yeah, because if you look at according to our definitions of good and evil, you know, how it's difficult to apply, it's hard to apply those to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Yeah.
My understanding was that God is always good, and that man decides to do, it's part of the free will aspect. Because I guess
Well, when you say God is good, what's your definition of good?
It's just like a creator of a machine. You create a machine to work, you create a and so when you're creating this machine, it's always brilliant, but then if there's a defect in something, it comes from, like if we had no free will, everything would be working perfectly, correct? If we had no free will, let's say God created the world that's perfect, it's going to be perfect, this is perfection. And so he's given us the chance to have free will. And how I understand it is, part of the alam al-mulk, right, is for us to have a nafs and if the nafs is in a state of Islam, the qalb will be in a state of iman, right? It kind of, it controls how you act, how you feel, how you think, how you're supposed to live in accordance in this world. And so if that nafs, which is part of free will, decides to go astray, then you create evil acts, correct?
Well, okay, yeah, there's a lot to say. Because for us to, I mean, I guess we can get back to the first part. When you say God is good, what is the definition of good that you're using here when you're applying it to God?
And someone who's perfect does not create defects. There's no defect in his creation. Does that make sense?
But there are, right?
So it might,
And we see defects in creation, right? We see,
but are they defects? That's my question.
well, yes, but those defects are, I mean, they have wisdom, there's purpose behind them. Yeah, so, you know, we clearly see, I mean, I'm defective, I know that. I can say that for the very least. You know, and so, there are clearly defects that we see, right, in creation. That's why, like, you know, when you say God is good, so you're saying God is perfect in that way. You know, I mean, like I said, Imam Ghazali, for example, would say that this is the most perfect of all possible worlds. Now, what does he mean by perfect? Meaning that the perfection here demands that good and evil exist, defects and, you know, all of that exists. You know, that this is in meaning. But what he's bringing about here is this concept of wisdom, that in light of, you know, looked at through the dictates of wisdom, this is the most perfect and best of all possible worlds that exist.
Okay, if I can just interject, inshallah, we're actually moving into the Q&A, which is great, because this is the time for Q&A. So I'll try and moderate the Q&As, make sure that we have the right balance between brothers and sisters, as well as for people online who'd like to ask questions. You can go to our Facebook page and ask questions there, or our Twitter feed at SeekersHub with the hashtag #UnderstandingEvil. So we'll try and keep the balance between the questions so that hopefully everybody gets to ask questions. So we've had some on the sister side. I don't know if there's any on the brother side before we move along.
Yes.
Looking at the bigger picture, how is the arrangement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created of the dunya and the Jannah and Jannah more merciful or more perfect than if he had just created Jannah?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a good question. So, I mean, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions very clearly here, I mean, between this difference of Allah's will, so he has irada, and the function of irada is to specify the qualities of a particular object of will. So, you know, for example, if, you know, this pen is an object of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, you know, but the will specifies that this pen is actually a red pen, but the color outside is black, the dimensions of the pen, right? All of these things will specifies it. It could have been white, it could have been purple, it could have been longer, it could have been shorter. All of these possibilities exist, right? So will comes and specifies every single, you know, quality of this pen. Now, so, and including this quality here now, what we're saying of good and evil, and the way the world is working, right? Now the question here is that, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, his, what's called his rida, his divine contentment, is he pleased, is his pleasure associated with his will, right, or not? So the question here is everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, right? I'm sorry, the question is he pleased with every single thing that he willed into existence or not? And according to Ahlul Sunnah, the answer is no. Many things, you know, of everything he's willed, certain things he's pleased of, and certain things he's not pleased of, right? And how do we know what he's pleased of? Well, that's why he's given us revelation, and he's told us what is good. So what is good is what divine pleasure is connected with, and it relates to that which is good. And what is evil and is what his divine displeasure is created with, or is linked with, is associated with. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرَ. And there's a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he is not pleased with the disbelief, the kufr of his servants. So the servants exist, that's through his will. The fact that they are disbelieving servants, right? That's also by his will. But is his divine pleasure connected with that? He tells us clearly, no. His divine pleasure is not connected with disbelief of his servants. You see, so what this means here is then that everything that comes into existence is through the will of Allah, but that doesn't mean that he's pleased with it. So some things in creation, his divine pleasure is associated with. Other things in creation, his divine wrath and displeasure is connected with. Right? And so that's why it's important to keep that in mind, that, if somebody, la samahallah, they went and this happens a lot, this is why I mentioned this, I've heard it in my own ears, is that, la samahallah, if a woman ever gets raped, right? And I've heard Muslims say this, to a particular sister, and I got really upset why they said this, but they said, oh, just be patient, this is Allah's will. Don't do anything, this is what Allah has willed, and just be patient and, kind of see it through. To me, that's absolutely the wrong thing to say to someone. And that's the wrong response to have, right? In other words, yeah, he willed it. But is he displeased with it? Is this munkar, is this evil? Absolutely. And what are we supposed to do to evil? What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us to do to any evil act that happens? We're supposed to remove it. We're supposed to forbid it. We're supposed to go against it. We're supposed to, fight against it. And instead, what's being told to this poor woman is, this is God's will, and now she's thinking, oh God, what else is there, So it's important to say, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it, but he's not happy with what happened to you. And you should go and fight it. That's what he told us, right? So there's every act that happens, there's kind of two levels in which we look at every particular act. One is from a strictly ontological perspective, meaning who created this? Who willed it into this? That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another level is he pleased with it or not? Right? And that we have to answer based on the Sharia. And so, same thing, if someone needs help, you don't say, well, God willed that you're drowning, so I'm not going to go against his will. No, that's not. He willed that this person is drowning, but this is evil. He's displeased with it. And what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to respond in saying, you save that person from drowning. You see? For some reason it turns into a determinism almost, in the Muslim community, where they use this idea to say God willed it, therefore don't do anything to change it. No. There's a whole other discussion after that. That's just the first part. Yeah, we know God willed this. That's not, is this right or wrong? And how do we determine that? We look at the Sharia to determine that. And based off of what we conclude, then we act. And we have to act. So this is an important thing to consider, to keep in mind. Could Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have, created everybody a believer? Well, he says that in the Quran, clearly, right? He says, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَآمَنَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كُلُّهُمْ جَمِيعًا. Right? This is in the Quran that should, were Allah to will, everybody on the earth could have been believers. All of them. But is that, is it in the divine power? Everybody believers? Absolutely. Did this happen? No. What is considered, which is, for us, we would think, well, it would be more wise to, and perfect to create everybody believers. But no, in actuality, it's more perfect to create everybody as, to give them the choice, and then they have to, they can be believers or disbelievers, which is what we see. So that's important, that, it's important to keep in mind that one is that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have been pleased with everybody believing, you see? But no, wisdom dictated then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom dictated that you have this differentiation, this variegation of people who are believers and people who are not. And that applies to everything else in creation, all the differences that we see in terms of good and evil and things like that. So the idea here is that in our minds we may think certain things are perfect. But that's where the problems start. And then we hold God to those same standards. But the problem with that is that our knowledge is extremely limited of what reality is and what reality consists of. And our judgment is always going to be pretty much, the one that we should hold in suspect, and let alone holding God accountable to the same standards, right, of what we consider to be perfect and what we consider to be, wise, and how the world should run in that case. Does that answer your question? If it doesn't, let me know. Kind of. What doesn't it answer?
I'm not sure yet.
It's not a problem, inshallah. Yeah.
There's no questions online. Is there a question from the sisters?
Is evil contingent on human action, or can it be a result? Can an act of evil be contingent on human action? If humans are going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not worshipping Him, can then an evil be a result of that, or is it dissociated?
Can you just repeat the question, Shaykh?
Yeah, so the question was, if I understand it correctly, is that can evil be the result of an act and not only the act itself? Is that what you were asking, or?
Yeah, if there's a group of humans that are consistently going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can an act of evil be inflicted upon them as a result of their action?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in terms of what are the consequences of their acts? Absolutely. I mean, the Quran mentions that, very clearly, in the sense that, about the corruption that appears. وَظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ, right? That corruption that appears on the land and in the seas by what human beings have done, And so this goes to the free will issue, that we have this freedom. So if we use it in a particular manner, that does have consequences. So there's a moral law, right? That just if you push someone off a cliff, there's gravity, they'll fall. For the most times I've seen it, So, same thing here. And there's moral laws that exist. You don't want to, if you do a particular act, then there are consequences. And it could be a moral act, but there are consequences that will result from that particular moral act being done as well. And yeah, usually it's evil acts will result in, evil consequences, And then also it depends on, people's intentions and who they are as well. Like the person that Shaykh mentioned as an example, even though he was with bad company for a while, right, at a certain time he was good, it just happened that he made certain choices then, So yes, the opposite could happen too. Bismillah.
Is the good that results out of the evil then a good that is to all, say for example, if you take 9/11 as an example, is the good that comes out of the evil to all humanity, or is it subjective to every single person who was inflicted with the suffering of 9/11? Or is it both?
No, that's a good question. The question is that the good that may come out of a particular evil act, such as 9/11, is that the good that that reaches or applies to every single person in humanity, or just to a particular group. It can be both. It can be both. But at the same time, we have to understand that even though wisdom and what's good, right, they're not related. So let me give you an example. Abu Lahab, in him being created, there's wisdom, and in him being, in hellfire, which is a nas of the Quran, there's wisdom. Is that good for him to be in hellfire? I think if you ask him, he won't say yes, right? This is by Nas of Quran, right? So wisdom and good and evil, they're not, just because something is wise doesn't mean that, it's necessarily good for that particular person. It's in that person's interest. In other words, is it in Abu Lahab's interest to be in hellfire? No, obviously not. But is it wise? Is there wisdom in him choosing this? Ultimately, yes. So all of Allah's acts are wise, but does that mean that all of Allah's interests of human beings? No. So you have to, the relationship between wisdom and good and evil have to be. I just wanted to make that clear on this issue. Yes.
Sorry. Just before just give the brothers
Oh yeah.
equal opportunity. Yeah. So
From Canada, no problem.
and so any other questions from other brothers? No. Okay. Well then, see the Elias. If nobody else is stepping up, you're allowed to.
Oh, there we go.
Oh.
Mashallah.
When animals are evil to each other, what is the type of scenario? Like, it's
Could you explain the question and a little bit further?
like there's no judgment against them, right? So, there's like when a lion attacks a deer or something like that, the deer is suffering, right? It's in
Correct.
pain and it's suffering until it dies, right?
Correct.
So, they don't, do they have free will? I mean, they don't have free will. Like, I mean, they have limited free will.
Okay. So your question is, will they be held accountable for their acts? And according to many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, there is evidence to indicate that animals will be also judged for their acts on the Day of Judgment, but then after their judgment has taken place, they're basically extinct. They'll be turned to dust and afterwards. There's a hadith that, it's a hadith Hasan that mentions that. So animals will be also, held accountable for their acts. And
It's
that,
their fitra, right? If their fitra, why would they be held accountable?
what do you mean, like, that's their fitrah? Like?
It's their instinct to, like, kill someone to eat, that's their food source. If it's a carnivorous animal, then God
Well,
created him like that.
Yeah. Well, what I meant was that, so, if somebody's eating a particular deer, a lion eating the deer, the example, that's not something that may be considered bad or evil for them. Animals act unjust, oppressive manner towards each other. Yes, I mean, we've seen, like, if you ever seen rams and, together they can fight and do a lot of, not for the reason of food, a food source, So, yeah, your example is correct, that if they're doing something as a food source, that doesn't mean it's evil, but there are other acts that they will, that they'll be held accountable for. There are hadith that are Hasan that indicate that ulama have mentioned.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. Is there anything online? Okay, now so the sisters. Sister here.
Was evil, do we know if evil was created only for our realm and the of the wisdom, do we know the wisdom of creating it because there's choice? Because we're told that angels are all good, so then there would be, in their realm, there would be evil would not exist for them. So does it have to do with that ability of choice? Or do we not know?
So your question is that, is the idea of good and evil freedom of choice, having the, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, because, and this is an important point that, Ahlul Sunnah, we do maintain very strongly that human beings have free will. Right? We're not determinists by any means of the word. And so we do have, we do maintain that human beings have free will. And based on this free will, that's where all accountability comes from. is premised on this understanding. Our us being accountable for our acts is premised on the fact that we have free will, and from that we have the freedom to choose. And then obviously choices. That's where good and evil comes into to play here. What's really interesting is the word in Arabic for choice, right? So in Arabic, freedom is a hur, someone who's free, hurriya is freedom. The word for choice in Arabic is ikhtiyar, right? And where that word comes from is khair, good. So choice, like a true choice, in that sense, is always a choice for the good, to do that which is good. It's really interesting, ikhtiyari, how it comes, ikhtara kada wa kada, and so the idea of having true choice is linked to this, the concept of good, and meaning that a choice for evil is not something that has, kind of this non-existent, you're in some way. So, and for us, freedom, it's not really a value for Muslims that it's thought of in the West, like, we're fighting for freedom and things like that. Freedom is more of a capacity. We consider freedom to be a capacity of human beings, and that capacity is to choose, and to choose that which is good. And that's what it's supposed to be for. So it's not really a value in this sense. When we think of, for Muslims, we don't consider freedom to be a value. We consider freedom, when we use it, it refers to the capacity of human beings to choose, and ultimately, if you're using it right, to choose that which is what is good. Yeah, does that help, inshallah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. I think we can all agree that this is probably just the beginning of a vast ocean of knowledge, and just from the questions alone, the depth of the knowledge that we've, I think, just begun on to comprehend is vast. So I would like to thank Shaykh Omar for spending his time, and Shaykh Faraz will do some closing remarks as well. But before he does, I'd just like to ask Sidi Amr just to come forward and make a couple of short announcements, and then we'll have Shaykh Faraz close off the session for us, inshallah.
All right, so just before we end, I think it's good if we can go back to the slide of the syllogism. We started with that, and let's look back to kind of review things to make sure that we've looking at this at the syllogism again in light of our discussion over here. So if we look at this, the first premise here, he's saying here is that God is almighty, and that that's not controversial. That's something that we can all agree upon. God is just and good, and so Sheikh Noah mentions over here. Here's where kind of the problem is in premise number 2 from our point of view, and he says here is that from our knowledge of Tawheed, the divine oneness and uniqueness, it is plain why the conclusion, therefore God is either not almighty or else not just and good, does not follow from these premises. Namely, because the key terms just and good, they're equivocal, meaning they can be applied in different ways. So the way we apply just and good, the way it's conceived of in the order of human beings, we can't necessarily apply them in the same way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in this premise here, we have to make that clear, and it's not making that clear. So it's using the words just as we understand it, and how it applies to human beings, and then we're applying that same usage and that same understanding to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where He doesn't work according to our standards, right? And so that's that's why it's equivocal. They are used in premise 2 as they apply to one order of being, right? So in number 2, let's say that you're saying God is just as it's supposed to be understood and applied to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in premise 3, they are used both as they apply to the divine and as they apply to an entirely distinct order of being, that of man, of whom it is usually true that someone just and good would not allow suffering and evil, even if he could prevent them. So in premise 3, we would normally think of a human being not allowing or for good and evil to take place, if they are just and good. But that doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would. We can't apply that same understanding of premise 3 to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because there's probably a greater reason and a greater wisdom why evil would and suffering would take place. But we don't have that understanding. And so there are reasons why good and evil would take place. He says, yet not always even then, since someone just and good might well choose the lesser of two evils, or impose temporary suffering by, say, surgery to effect a cure, or for innumerable other ethically valid reasons. And so this is the problem with this form of argument here. The way just and good are, those terms are being used in premise 3 are not the same as they're being used in premise 2. Whereas in order for it to be a logically valid argument, the terms have to be used in each premise in exactly the same way. So this is what's called the fallacy of equivalents. In other words, the terms just and good in premise 2 are not equivalent to the terms just and good in premise 3. And so that's why this conclusion, God is neither almighty, not almighty, or else not just and good, that conclusion doesn't follow from these premises. It's an invalid conclusion to make. So that will be good just to look at that and just mention those comments and not leave you without showing the fallacious nature of this syllogism that people would experience, inshallah. Sorry.
Again, Jazakallah khairan, Shaykh Omar, for your enlightening talk. Inshallah, it's good to have you here with us at SeekersHub, and we hope that this is just the beginning of many more engagements with us, inshallah, in the future. You're not too far away from what we know, and so we know where you live. So we can get you, inshallah, and bring you here, inshallah, more often. So with that, I'd like to ask Sidi Amr to come and just make a few announcements. As well, I've been told that we do have some refreshments after the session closes. So after Sidi Amr does the announcements, Sheikh Faraz will make a closing statement, and then there'll be refreshments available for people afterwards if you'd like to talk and discuss more, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So inshallah, continuing the seminars next week, on Saturday there will be a seminar entitled Jihad, Revolt and Revolution Islam. Inshallah, conducting the seminar will be Shaykh Faraz and Shaykh Ahmed Saad al-Azhari from the UK. And they will be answering the question, what is jihad and what role does it play in seeking political change and social justice in our times? Is revolt and rising up for change against professionals? So these and other questions, inshallah, will be answered at that seminar. Do, inshallah, try to come out for that. It's highly beneficial, inshallah, and addresses very contemporary and ongoing issues. Also, this coming weekend, tomorrow, Shaykh Omar Qureshi alongside Shaykh Talal Ahdab and Shaykh Ramzi Ajam will be conducting a symposium at UFT with the Muslim chaplaincy entitled Faith and Modern Times, Ancient Wisdom for Contemporary Questions. So they'll be speaking about contemporary questions such as new atheism and expanding on the problem of evil, epistemology, and other contemporary topics. So do go out for this beneficial and relevant symposium. Shaykh Talal Ahda, for those that know him, they're probably already going to be there. For those that don't know him, he's one of the the hidden gems of Toronto. He hasn't taught for the past 5 years. He's actually one of the first teachers of Shaykh Faraz, Shaykh Ramzi, and a lot of the shuyukh here in Toronto. So do make an effort to go out to this unique opportunity, inshallah. So with that, I'd like to also remind you that, inshallah, all the classes that we've offered here at SeekersHub are ongoing and free. So there's a curriculum that happens on the weekends as well as other classes. Do check out the website, and if you haven't signed up for the mail in order to be able to be updated with visiting scholars or any other, do sign up to the mailing list up at the front and check the website, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. We'll just close by reminding ourselves of a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ said, عَجَبًا لِأَمْرِ الْمُؤْمِنِ إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ لَهُ خَيْرٌ وَلَيْسَ ذَلِكَ لِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا لِلْمُؤْمِنِ. How strange are the affairs of the believer, for all their affairs are for their good, and that is for no one but the believer. إِنْ أَصَبَتْهُ سَرَّاءَ شَكَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. Matters occur to them, they are thankful, and that is good for them. When أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاءَ صَبَرْ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. And if distressful matters happen to them, they remain patient, and that is also for their good. So we see from that in many other hadiths that the good and evil in our own lives arise from our responses to what Allah sends to us. And in that light, whatever happens to the believer is for their good. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, and we quoted this hadith because it's such a powerful hadith. The Prophet ﷺ's own granddaughter died in his hands. He started crying, but he saw Hani cry, and he said, Ya Hani, ma hadha Hani, what is that crying? She said, Ya Rasulullah, alastu araka tabki? O Messenger of Allah, do I not see you crying? Because he had tears flowing down his cheeks. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he said, هذا ليس ببكاء. This is not crying. إنما هو رحمة. This is only mercy. It's the same event. You're crying and I'm crying. But she was crying out of a sense of loss, out of a sense of latent, indirect objection that why did this happen? Oh no. This crying was a crying of contentment, the crying of concern, the crying of mercy. They said, this is not crying. It is but mercy. Then he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّ الْمُؤْمِنَ بِكُلِّ خَيْرٍ فِي كُلِّ حَالٍ. The believer is in all good in all their states. The believer may be facing death, yet they are praising Allah Most High, because they see that whatever happens is from Allah, and that our responsibility, our good and our evil is in how we respond to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to us. Right? And that's something that we should remember. الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ. He is you, who has created for you death and life and all that's between those two to try you. It's all a trial. Right? أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. Which of you will be best in their actions? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make us of those who see everything as being from Him, and who understand that our good is in responding to it in accordance with the ways that are pleasing to Him, the ways that make us His generosity unto His good pleasure. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grant us the clarity of faith and the clarity of understanding and the clarity of state and conduct and action to make the right choices and to be of those who turn to Him through that light of His beloved Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wa salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. We missed out one announcement. On Sunday is the Lottery fundraiser. It's just down the road. It's at the Sayyidah Khadija Center. We have the poster at the front. It's Sunday starting at 4 o'clock, Sayyidah Khadija Center. Lottery has, Shaykh Zahir Baqis is a truly wonderful project, not just for those who are benefiting from it, but it is a model and setting a standard for Islamic education. And it's a project truly worthy of supporting. So you can make a donation from here if you're not able to attend, but go out of your way to attend and to show your support, even if you're not in Brampton or sending your children there. This is a sure way to to gain benefit for your own children is to have concern for the children of others, and a project that is of ummatic consequence. It's a truly blessed project by one of our dearly beloved scholars. Alhamdulillah, Shaykh Zahir, month and a half, 2 months, has been running all over. MashaAllah, they've raised, I think, 300,000 of the 500,000 that they need to raise before the fundraising dinner. Smart, Shaykh. Of course, he owes me a couple of dinners in the way because I've done a few khutbahs on his behalf and gotten in trouble as a result. So he owes me a few meals, but we should really be supporting them, inshallah. So give, as the Prophet ﷺ described, give with the giving of someone who does not fear poverty. That no wealth diminishes through giving, and you'll see the good in it and you won't find any evil.